All right, everybody, welcome in to the Alley-Oop. I'm your host, Ryan Blackburn at NBA Blackburn on Twitter. Thank you so much for an awesome week of a debut episode. We are on to day 5 now, Friday, of the Alley-Oop podcast, and that means we're on to the 5th division of season previews. This time we're doing the Southeast, and if you're listening to this one, you'll hear about the Atlanta Hawks from Brad Rowland, who does Locked On Hawks. You'll hear about the Charlotte Hornets from Walker Mehl, who's on Locked On Hornets and WFNZ Charlotte Local Radio. You'll hear about the Miami Heat from Wes Goldberg of All You Can Heat and Locked On Heat. You'll hear about the Orlando Magic from Stephen Cameron and Orlando Magic HQ. And then you'll hear about the Washington Wizards from Neil Dalal of Hoop District and also Sports Rabbi. Really appreciate everybody for hopping in. If you can, please rate, review, and subscribe if you've listened to the episodes and you like what you hear. And if you're a new viewer, tell your friends. Tell your friends, new national podcast that covers this as authentically as I possibly can. So thank you so much for all of the love and support. And without further ado, here is the Alley-Oop.
Giannis trailing the lob. Oh! Run, 2-on-1. Green to finish. Wow, the alley-oop. LeBron turned the corner inside. He made Yusuf Nurkic's screensaver. Here comes Murray. Alley-oop to Gordon. Oh, what a play.
All right, joining me now is Brad Rowland, at BT Rowland on Twitter, writing for Dime and for his own Patreon, as well as the host of the Locked On Hawks podcast. Brad, thank you so much for taking the time this season, man. Really looking forward to speaking with you about the Hawks this year.
Absolutely happy to do it, and always fun to talk ball.
Should be great. And talking ball, I mean, got to start with the Hawks here. Should be a very intriguing team. Not as many changes as one might think, but I do see a loss with John Collins in at least a couple of different categories, but maybe a gain in some other categories by giving some opportunities to some other players. What do you think is the most interesting thing about this Hawks team going into the year?
You kind of tease it out there in that they didn't do a ton. And, before last season, they had been in the play-in 2 years ago, and they kind of made their big splash move with DeJounte Murray, thinking that would take them back to kind of where they were the previous year, which was a conference finalist. And that didn't obviously happen. They kind of returned almost exactly to where they were the previous year, which was getting out of the play-in, losing in the first round in pretty lopsided fashion. So, and they kind of ran it back this time around. You mentioned Collins not being there. That's the biggest personnel change, and that's a minus, not a positive. Even if you think that they have internal guys, and they do, that's not a plus to your roster to lose John Collins for nothing, essentially, in a trade. I think the biggest thing is that they're really banking on the work of Quinn Snyder. That's kind of the messaging and the way that they're talking, both on the record, behind the scenes, all that stuff. They're banking on a combination of Snyder and internal development. And yes, Snyder came in the middle of last year, but I think it was such a bizarre situation. I think outside of Atlanta, it didn't get covered that way necessarily, but a guy with his pedigree taking over as late as he did for a team that was not tanking or not rebuilding, like they were trying to win. It just that never happens. Like, I couldn't find a parallel to that, and they all acknowledged how weird it was. But the big thing is that they now have a full summer, a full training camp, kind of the full install with Snyder, and they're hoping, I think internally especially, that's going to kind of pay off for them, because it's really their big addition.
He's an interesting coach. He has always gotten the most out of a lot of his teams. The Utah teams we're very familiar here with in Denver, and he's always done a great job of especially maximizing during the regular season. I got to be honest, when I was building out the roster, the rotation, the depth chart for this team, I forgot about AJ Griffin when I didn't even put him in my top 10, because there's so many other talented names that you could really point to on this Atlanta team. They've got a lot of guys that you can really pick and choose from. How do you see the starting lineup breaking down this year? Is it going to be the same? Is it going to be different? And are maybe some of the young guys ready to step into larger roles?
Yeah, I think broadly speaking, the big question in terms of the guys who are still here is who breaks out, if anyone, out of the young guys. Like you said, AJ Griffin, Jalen Johnson's a name that people are going to be familiar with. It's going to play more. He's also, I would say, in contention for the 5th starter job, because really, the starting lineup from last year, only Collins is gone, and you would expect that they're going to run it back with 4 of the same 5, being Trae Young, DeJounte Murray, DeAndre Hunter at one of the forward spots, and then Clint Capella, as long as he's still on the team. And there was some talk about maybe him being traded in the summer. As long as he's here, he's going to start, I would imagine. So there's that 5th spot, which is mostly power forward. DeAndre Hunter can play a little bit at the 4 as well, but it seems to me, and look, we're it's not certain at the time that we're talking, but I think it's going to be either Sadiq Bey, who is more of the offense floor spacer, more of a combo forward type, or it's Jalen Johnson as the 5th starter, and he's more of a interesting kind of hybrid player. He's power forward size, but not a great shooter. That'd be more of the defensive option. So I don't want to build it offense versus defense, but it kind of is in some ways, because Bey is certainly more of an offensive player. But that's the only, really, at least for me, the only real point of question is that 5th spot.
It should be fascinating. That's actually, Jalen Johnson's not actually the name I thought you were going to bring up. I thought you were going to say AJ Griffin. I think Onyeka Okongwu has a great case to be the starting center for this team going forward, just going into his 4th season. And he's going to be one of those interesting names that he nearly outpaced Capella in the minutes department this last year. And I think they're going to want to continue to build around him and put him into positions to succeed, I assume. But it should be interesting to see where the kind of that dividing line is, because I look at the bench for the Hawks and there's just a lot of talent there. There's a lot of interesting pieces there. Still not sure how it's going to fit together, but I guess that's a job for Quinn Snyder and not me.
Yeah, and when you mentioned Okongwu, I'm very high on Okongwu. It's really a delicate balance, because I've long thought that they were going to trade Capella by now, honestly, and I say that as someone who is very high on Capella. As I think he's still a pretty good starting center. It's just that they have basically 2 starting centers, and maybe this is the first time they finally try those guys together. To this point, they've not really played at all together, and that kind of limits, at that position in particular, center more than any other spot. If you have 2 centers, they really don't play a ton together unless you're just comfortable with that. So that's something to keep an eye on, because, yeah, I think long-term it'll be Okongwu for sure as the guy. It's just we haven't reached that point yet that they've cleared the decks for him. But, yeah, this is a team that has some pretty decent depth. You mentioned AJ Griffin, of course. They brought in some quality, kind of low-cost but high-profile veterans. Patty Mills is here on this team. Wes Matthews on this team. Again, on the minimum for Wes Matthews. But guys who can kind of be plug and play. And then their 6th man is Bogdanovich, and Bogdan is, I think, one of the best 6 men in the league in that role. I mean, he's certainly showcased that he is healthy in the World Cup this summer, and that's been the only limitation for him the last couple of years, is he's had some knee trouble. But if he's healthy, he's a really dynamic offensive player that is probably overqualified for the role he's in, honestly. But when you have a team that has Trae and DeJounte, it's kind of tough to start Bogdanovich, but he's very, very good as a 6th man option, and they have quality. They have probably 10, 11, 12 guys that I would describe as rotation players, and that's not a bad place to be, especially when you add a couple of veterans that don't have to play in Mills and Matthews, that certainly can if they're asked to.
I think it's completely fair, and I look at this team and I look at the way that they tried to play last year, where you have Trae and DeJounte, you stagger those guys, you play them as the starting backup point guards for each of those units, and there's a lot of different ways that you can get creative. They're not always going to play together. But the one thing I really wanted to point out when focusing on this team, I was looking at some numbers for them. Plus 0.3 net rating when Trae and DeJounte share the floor together. What's up with that?
Yeah, it was one of the well, there are 2 questions. There's this whole theory of the case that I won't do the long version for you, but when they traded for DeJounte, it was 2 things. It was having someone to play with Trae who could defend at the point of attack, and also take some of the heat off him, because Trae is awesome and he's going to carry their offense a lot, but they've never really had that number 2 creator next to him. And then almost especially, they wanted DeJounte to single-handedly boost things when Trae was off the court, because that's been a disaster for the entirety of the Trae Young era. Whenever he sits, it's very similar to Jokic in Denver. Not quite as bad as that, but you know what I mean? Sure. It's like when he sits, it's just the end of the world. Right. And really none of that came to fruition, unfortunately, for the Hawks. And that kind of leads to why they weren't so good last year in some ways, is that, like you point out, they were not a disaster when they played together. Like, net even is not horrible, but it's not what you need. I mean, if you're going to have your 2 best players playing together and you have aspirations to be a high-level playoff team, you can't be a +0 essentially when they're playing together. Yeah. And then when Trae sat, they were still awful. Maybe they were slightly less awful than previous years, but they were -6, -7, however you want to look at that, depending on which set of numbers you're looking at. So I think they're hoping that Snyder's going to put them in better positions. I even called my shot a little bit on this one last year. I think Nate McMillan was probably the worst possible coach to have those two guys. And look, I think Nate's gotten a lot of heat locally, probably too much in some respects, but he's a very old school, like not innovative guy. And I think when you have these two point guards, and that's really what they are, playing together, some creativity is going to be necessary. And I think some off-ball actions that Trey's not necessarily capable, well, maybe not capable, used to running, I would say. And then DeJounte's kind of a limited off-ball player. I mean, that's one of the sneaky things. Like, Trae Young is too good to be put off the ball a lot, but DeJounte Murray is a pretty limited off-ball player. He's not a great shooter. Like, he's an okay shooter, but he's not comfortable in that role. So there's some work to be done there. And like, I'm glad you brought it up, because if they get where they want to go, they're going to need those guys to be, +5, +6, +7, whatever that number is. It can't be +0, +1, or they'll be back in the play-in again probably.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be a question mark, but they have the talent and the surrounding, I think, supporting cast to really help boost those numbers. There's no reason why lineups with Trae, DeJounte, and then a couple of the wings and forwards, and then one of the bigs, like all of those lineups should be relatively good. I don't see why they wouldn't be. They've got the talent to do so. So I guess my question is, last year, go 41-41, first round exit. Give a couple nice games against the Boston Celtics in the playoffs, but nothing too crazy. Does your win total really change that much? You lose John Collins, gain a couple of vets, but nothing too crazy. Does your win total change from 41-41 too much?
Yeah, I would certainly take the over on that number this year. For a couple of reasons. Number one, I do think that Snyder is an upgrade, and especially the regular season, coaching at that level can really kind of matter, especially defensively, like just system building and having more, because this has been a bad defensive team for the vast majority of the last 4 or 5 years. Even when they made their run, that was their best defensive team that they've had, but it wasn't a great defensive team. But I think that the combination of better infrastructure, a little bit of internal development, and I think crucially more shooting on the floor. Last year they were, I think, 7th in offense, which is still quite good, of course, but a lot of that was later in the season when they brought in Saddiq Bey, who hurt their defense. I will point that out. Saddiq was pretty rough defensively last year when he arrived, but in his defense, he was coming into a new system and kind of had to figure it all out. But immediately, the combination of Snyder and Saddiq Bey, the offense kicked up, and they were in the top 3 or 4 in the second half of the season after Snyder took over. So I think it's still a team that's going to be offense first. When you have Trae Young as your focal point, it's kind of inevitable. But I think that generally speaking, I think that kind of their offensive floor is what we saw last year, which is like 7 or 8 in the league. Like, they're going to be really good offensively. Unless Trae goes down, which of course is every caveat that everybody has with their star player. Right. But the question is, can they be better defensively? And I think that the answer is yes. How much better? Up for debate, certainly. I would not say that there's a top 10 group in this particular personnel set, but I think with Snyder and quality center play and some other stuff to button up on the edges, getting into that like 18 to 20 range defensively, which isn't sexy at all, but that's a big step forward from where they've been the last couple of years. That would kind of push them into that kind of mid-40s win tier, and that's meaningfully better than where they were last year.
Yeah, right now I've got them at 45 wins. I think that that's the right call. I think there are some questions as to what the actual structure of the team will look like without John Collins, but I think it will be better. I think it makes more sense, if I'm being frank. They had 3 bigs last year when you're playing Capella, Collins, and Okongwu, and sometimes that's just too much, and sometimes you just need 2, and they've got 2 traditional bigs. They're going to be very good with both of those guys on the floor. And there's no reason why Okongwu can't take a step forward. There's no reason why AJ Griffin and Jalen Johnson can't take a step forward and really provide a little bit more stability than maybe they did last year. So I like them. I think that they're going to be good. I have them at 5th in the East right now, and I have them as a second round exit because I have them playing the Philadelphia 76ers in the first round, in which case I think I would take Atlanta, but I'm not sure I see much more than that. Do you see a pathway for this team to make a deep-ish playoff run?
I mean, I would say it's not particularly likely. Is there a path? Sure, there is. I mean, like you mentioned, the offensive fit with Collins was a little bit clunky. It always was, because he's better as a pick and roll guy, and that they couldn't really have him do that next to a traditional center. It's like one of those things that Quinn Snyder has this team now that fits better to his liking with more spacing around him. But like we've seen them be an interesting playoff team. Of course, it was 2 years ago. It was a weird season, but they did make a run, and they pulled off an upset against Philadelphia, and then I think people have kind of forgotten that was a close series against Milwaukee. They didn't get blown out by the Bucks. That was kind of surprising in some ways, and I'm not saying they're going to do that again. But I think the combination of the offensive ceiling that they can reach, and a coach that knows what he's doing, and an East that like outside of the top two is probably kind of open. I'm not saying that they're like going to be a 3 seed or anything like that, but I think there's a pathway. It would probably take them getting a top 3 or 4 seed to have them get into a second round or beyond discussion, because if you start facing off with teams at the top in the first round like they had the last 2 years, that's tough sledding. I think the upside is it's real. I think they're probably a piece away though. Like if they had made the Siakam move that got rumored in the offseason, that would have been kind of a push in your chips kind of move, and then things would have been raised up. But as it's currently constructed, I think reasonably this is still a similar roster that was 41-41 last year. So like asking them to kind of make a leap without, and there were no huge injuries last year either. It's like almost all internal development and Snyder. And like, yeah, you can get better, but like saying, okay, conference finals time is probably a little bit aggressive, I would say.
We will see what happens. I am looking forward to watching the Hawks, and I'm looking forward to hearing from you, Brad, over the course of this season. Should be a lot of fun. Again, Brad does great work for his Patreon, for Dime, for Locked On Hawks. Make sure to go follow his work throughout the season. Thank you so much, Brad. All right, joining me now is Walker Mehl, covering Charlotte for Locked On Hornets, as well as WFNZ. He is a Charlotte local radio host. Walker, thank you so much for hopping on, man. Really excited to get your Charlotte Hornets coverage for this season.
Yeah, man, I appreciate you having me. It will be fun to check in, and we'll see what the Hornets do. It's hard to figure out, as a lot of these Eastern Conference teams are, but man, it should be fun along the way.
As many of these teams go, this is just another team that I look at the rotation and the roster and think, man, there's a lot of rotation players here. There's a lot of talents here. There's a lot of guys that last year Charlotte goes 27-55, and then there's reasons to believe that they will be better. Most notably, I think, Miles Bridges and the reintegration of him. Is that the most interesting thing with the team right now? How do you think things are going?
Yeah, I think that's certainly fair to say. If you were to look at the top 3 storylines, if you were to try to dwindle this down and break up, okay, these are the top 3 interesting things. One is LaMelo, who, despite having a second overall pick, despite having Miles Bridges come back into the fold, they invested $200 million in LaMelo this offseason. No brainer. As soon as he was eligible for that rookie max extension, he got it. So LaMelo, coming off of all those ankle injuries, he was in and out of the lineup before the last one finally did him in. He played 36 games. That was it. Can LaMelo stay healthy enough to continue to be that guy and maybe even take a step up back into being an all-star like he was 2 years ago? LaMelo Ball taking that step and continuing to ascend. Hopefully that happens for the Charlotte Hornets. I think that's the number one thing everybody's paying attention to, in particularly like pick and roll game, defensively. That's what I would look at. The second one I would say is the second overall pick. Brandon Miller comes in as a guy where it's a different situation than Scoot Henderson in Portland. They trade Damian Lillard. It's pretty obvious they want him to be the guy. He gets the keys. You're going to get a lot of volume from Scoot. You're going to get a lot of volume from Wemby, as, I guess depending on the minutes restriction they have, it's clearly his team. It's not necessarily the case here with Brandon Miller. It's different compared to the other 2 of the 3 overall picks. So now with Brandon coming in, you have LaMelo, it's his team. Miles Bridges coming in as a fringe all-star 2 years ago. You also have Terry Rozier and Gordon Hayward, who are at least veterans on this squad. They're good for 15 points per game. Brandon does not have a ton of responsibility, but even Steve Clifford has been adamant, whether it's been Hornets Media Day, whether he's hopping on Sirius XM radio, it doesn't matter. He's telling you that Brandon Miller is going to have a significant role. And this is coming from a guy that has a reputation that actually doesn't play rookies a lot.
Right.
Whether it's fair or unfair, Steve is very aware of that reputation. And he's telling you right now, Brandon Miller is going to have a significant impact as soon as we start playing basketball October 25th. So I'd say LaMelo, Brandon, and then I'd go with Miles. He's suspended the first 10 games of the regular season. He's not allowed to play in the preseason. They have their first game October 10th, tonight, against the Miami Heat. So how do you integrate him back into the system, right? This is the first time he's played under Steve Clifford. Last time he played with the Hornets, it was all under James Borrego. So there are things to learn. Plus, the guy hadn't played basketball in over a year. So how much is he going to have to knock off that rust defensively, offensively, all encompassing as soon as he comes back onto this team? So yeah, I think those would be the three most interesting storylines.
There's a lot of elements here. There's a lot of elements for a team that had been in kind of the fringes of the playoff picture for a little bit, but has gone backwards this last year, certainly, and looked almost unserious at times, the way that either things were approaching and the way that the Miles Bridges situation panned out and kind of just the way that they played. And I think a lot of that is going to come back down to LaMelo, and a lot of that's going to come back down to Steve Clifford making sure that everybody's going on the same direction. So I'm curious what kind of team this group wants to be, and whether LaMelo is the guy that you pay $200 million for. Is he the guy that you're going to want leading that charge? I think there's a lot of questions about that nationally, at least.
Yeah, they want him to be the guy. And I think over this past offseason, I feel like nationally, people forgot how good LaMelo is with a full bill of health. Because if you go back to his rookie season, all the big-time national NBA pundits made it a point to say that LaMelo was affecting winning, which is really hard for a rookie to come in and do. That was the narrative. Now it's the complete opposite. Now you view what he did in those last 36 games where he was the only guy. Gordon Hayward's hurt. Miles Bridges isn't on the team anymore. You got guys in and out of the lineup. He's having to take over, and he gets a little too shot happy. Like, I get it. There was this level of ball hoggy type to his game. Like, I understand that. You also want him shooting a lot. If he's the best three-point shooter you have, especially with a down year coming from Terry Rozier, you don't have Miles Bridges. PJ got a little too much volume last season that it better suits him to be a role player 3-and-D without having as much usage. But they needed to go that route because at times he was the only healthy starter that you had on this squad. So with LaMelo coming back into the fold, hopefully healthy, he's wearing ankle braces this season, Ryan. Hopefully he's able to play as much as possible. I hope he gets back to that all-star billing that he had 2 years ago. He doesn't even have to take as much responsibility. Better players are going to make the product look better, period. So Terry Rozier, Gordon Hayward, PJ, another year of Mark Williams, who looks very good coming into his second season. I think all of that's going to help. And so, LaMelo offensively, Steve Clifford is letting him run the show. There was a little bit of worry about Steve Clifford running an NBA offense that is high-paced. Fast-paced. Well, when LaMelo was in the lineup, they were top 10 in pace. And there were legitimate questions about it with Clifford at the helm, but I think he answered that. He let LaMelo run things when he was there. He wasn't holding him back. Defensively, even after the All-Star break, they started to play a lot better defensively. One of the better defensive rated teams in all of the NBA, which is shocking because the Hornets notoriously play awful defense, especially under Borrego. So, there are some reasons to be optimistic about this squad.
I look at the rotation and I see 8 guys I think that have a significant chance of starting. I see LaMelo, Terry Rozier, Gordon Hayward, Miles Bridges, Mark Williams. That's who I have penciled in as the group right now. But PJ Washington started and I think has a claim to it after the contract that he signed this last offseason. Brandon Miller, the number 2 overall pick, and then Nick Richards is the other guy, is maybe the other center that maybe they decide to go with over Mark Williams. But it sounds like maybe it's Mark Williams's role at this stage.
Yep. So you're right about these guys getting rotation minutes. Nick Richards will be the backup center. Mark Williams got that job, really started to be a part of the rotation after Christmas last year. So people were a little, they were wondering why Mark Williams, it took him so long to see the floor, especially when you didn't have that deep of a center position. But man, once Mark hit the floor, defensively altered a lot of shots. Really smart basketball player. Offensively even has a little touch, and he's got a lot more confidence. You can see it, put on the muscle watch season. Mark Williams being certainly a product of that. He's going to start at center. Nick Richards is going to back him up. The real question is, okay, when we get to the front court, are you going to roll with Gordon Hayward and Miles Bridges as the 3-4 combo once Miles comes back? But PJ is going to start at the beginning of the season. So once we hit that 11th game, are you letting Miles Bridges buy a little time before you throw him into the fire? And if the Hornets start like 6-4, if they actually have an above 500 or right at 500 record, then do you not want to mess with that chemistry, especially with Clifford allowing his rotation to develop chemistry? Like he'll stick with a group for quite a while. Then are you just going to, ease Miles Bridges in up until like December because of all the basketball that he's missed? What kind of chemistry he's building with? The Gordon Hayward, PJ Washington, Miles Bridges, 2 starting spots combo. That's what I'm really interested in. Brandon Miller will come off the bench, in my opinion. He'll have a significant role. I don't think he'll start, but it's Gordon, PJ, and Miles as like Gordon probably starting at 3, Miles and PJ at 4. That's going to be fascinating to see what they do.
Is there a possibility that maybe they even start Brandon Miller at the 2 eventually and try to go with a supersized group?
Terry being a veteran on this squad is probably always going to start at 2. At least that's how I would see it. Steve Clifford also praised his veterans, praised the hell out of Terry Rozier and Gordon Hayward. Terry spends his off seasons in Miami. He came back a month earlier, and he told everybody this offseason it's the most excited he's ever been to put on a Hornets uniform.
Wow.
Maybe I'm naive. That's fine. Maybe I'm buying into the rumors that typically come about this offseason. I believe it, though. And I think I believe it because if you go back to last offseason, the vibes, they were so dark. They were not good. You're talking about Miles having been arrested for felony domestic violence. You're talking about LaMelo, remember, even injuring himself in the preseason before you start to go into the regular season. They were not good. And now you have Miles back. Depending on how you feel about it, the team, they feel good about it. They really like Miles as a teammate. So they feel good about it. Mark Williams looks like the real deal as a starting center, in my opinion. They feel really good about this squad. So if Terry Rozier comes in as the vet, I do think that he'll start as long as he's healthy. I think he'll start alongside LaMelo, with Brandon possibly playing some supersized backcourt, but I think it'll be off the bench. Maybe you experiment with some closing lineups, but I think they're always going to want to roll with Terry for the most part.
All right, so last year I mentioned they won 27 games. This year I had it slated that they'd win 29, which feels low based off of what they've added to this group, what like the amount of talent that they're getting back with a Miles Bridges, with a Brandon Miller as a 2nd overall pick coming in, hopefully a healthier LaMelo Ball. It's just really difficult with this Eastern Conference, especially kind of that 8 to 13 range where you just don't know who's gonna drop out, and maybe it is the Hornets that rises up to the top of that group. And I look stupid when I say 29 wins, but where do you think your win total would stand at this point?
Well, no, I think nationally that's probably a pretty good guess, or at least compared to anybody else judging this team. I just think that this team suffered so many injuries last year. LaMelo only playing 36. We've referenced that quite a bit. But here are the guys that played the most amount of games for the team last season. So it's PJ, who played 73, could have played more, but it was at the end. I think he was suffering some kind of injury, and they didn't rush to bring him back. JT Thor played the 2nd most amount of games. Nick Richards played the 3rd most amount of games. Then it's Terry Rozier, but then it's Mason Plumlee, Jalen McDaniels, Dennis Smith Jr., all in the top 7. 3 of those guys, or 2 of them in Mason and Jalen, and then Dennis Smith Jr., I should say 3, they're not even on the team. But you had to rely on him so much because LaMelo gets hurt. Terry Rozier missed some time. He had 63 games under his belt and still appeared in the 4th most amount of games last season. I just think because of the health, because they do add Brandon Miller as a 2nd overall pick, I'm buying a ton of stock in Mark Williams. I just think he's going to be a big-time factor with this team, especially defensively. And then you have to factor in 2 Miles Bridges coming back. 27 they were able to get without those guys. 29 does seem low to me. I think you're probably, if I were to set the over-under, if I was in charge of all the lines, maybe 35 is probably what I'd roll with, something like that. And the goal for the Hornets should be to get in the play-in, not get blown out like they did 2 straight times when they got to the play-in, and find a way to get a top 6 spot. Like, get some legitimate playoff experience. Even if you get boat raced, 4-0 sweep by the number 1 seed just because you got the number 8 seed, that's fine. You have to get to the playoffs somehow. Don't get blown out in the play-in tournament. That should be the goal. And so I think with the guys they have coming back, with some of the talent that is, kind of a pseudo addition in the Miles Bridges situation with LaMelo being hurt so much, I think that 35 is probably what I would set the over-under at.
So you would call a successful season at this point, just based off of where they were, kind of the progression that they're going through. A successful year would be to crack that top 10 at least, and then win in the play-in tournament.
Oh yeah, I think. Look, top 6 outright, skipping the play-in tournament altogether. That's going to be out of the cards. I think the most optimistic of fans would say even that's still a little too rich. I would say that the goal should be. The most optimistic of realistic scenarios, host a play-in tournament if everybody's clicking, host a play-in tournament game, and then win that game, and then get to the playoffs. Find a way to break into, one of those spots after you find a way to get there through the play-in tournament. I think that should be the goal, because this is a team, what was it, 3 years ago now, the Hornets get blown out by Indiana by like 30 points.
Right.
They print the box score as a reminder how badly that hurt, and then they get beat by a worse margin the next year by the Atlanta Hawks. It was a disaster.
Yeah.
And so now that's what led to Borrego's firing. A lot of people questioned it. I get it. But they got destroyed in 2 play-in tournament games, and that was it for Borrego. So can they do that? Now, Steve Clifford almost gets a pass for what happened last year because they suffered as many injuries, I would imagine, as any NBA team. So this year, if everybody's healthy, what can Steve Clifford do with this squad? And if you can get in the playoffs via the play-in tournament, I think that's the goal that I and a lot of Hornets fans have in mind.
Well, Walker, we will see what happens. He is Walker Mehl covering Charlotte for Locked On Hornets. Make sure to check out his afternoon show, WFNZ, on Charlotte Local Radio. Walker, thank you so much for tuning in for this episode, and I'm excited to hear about your Charlotte Hornets coverage this season.
Yeah, man, we'll see how it goes. I appreciate you having me on. This was a lot of fun.
All right, here with Wes Goldberg, editor-in-chief of All You Can Heat and host of the Locked On Heat podcast. Wes, thank you so much for taking your time with me this season. I really do appreciate you hopping on.
Yeah, Ryan, of course. Thanks for inviting me.
Of course. What do you think is the most interesting thing about the Miami Heat right now, other than maybe just being involved in a bunch of trade rumors?
It's how they respond to coming out of those trade rumors, having not done any of those trades, isn't it? Like, all these guys, or a lot of these guys, were either very much a part of those trade discussions, in the case of somebody like Tyler Hero and even Kyle Lowry. And other guys were a little bit on the periphery, wondering if they were going to be thrown into some sort of bigger deal, whether you're a Caleb Martin, Duncan Robinson, the young guys like Nikola Jovic, who's going into his second year, rookie Jaime Jaquez Jr. Like, this whole team didn't really know where it stood going into even Media Day. And then on Media Day, we get the report that the Heat were even trying to get in on the Drew Holiday stuff after the Damian Lillard stuff, and who knows what that would have involved, but likely, again, a lot of the same players that we just mentioned. So this team is largely the same as it was last year, although we'll get to some of the key differences here between the last year's finals teams and this one. But even more than just sort of bringing back that relatively same group, the dynamics in that team it just feels like it's changed a little bit, having been around them in training camp. It's just, you could tell, like, it's like, okay, does the team have faith in us? Do the fans have faith in us? And all this kind of stuff. And so, yeah, you can say that adds a chip on their shoulder, but I just think that the dynamics within the organization between the players and all these things, that to me is what I'm watching right now.
It does feel like over the course of these last 3 or so years that the Heat have been on the periphery of just about every star trade that you could ask for, whether it was Bradley Beal or Damian Lillard or Giannis back in the day. There's plenty of different names that I think you could throw out there that the Heat have been rumored for. And I wonder, and then just some of the reaction that Tyler Hero seemed to have, and that other guys in those trade proposals coming back to the team again for this time around. How do you recreate that magic, I think, is a fair question after being in so many talks over the season. Is the team, you think, not necessarily chemistry issues, but is, like you said, that there may not be the same spark?
Yeah, and look, they have pretty much brought back the same team now 3 years in a row. You mentioned some of the names that they've been trying to get. You can add Kevin Durant and Donovan Mitchell into the mix last summer too, right? They were even involved in maybe some possible KD discussions before the trade deadline, before we was obviously moved to Phoenix. So there's been sort of this this impression from the front office's actions that they think that they need to add another superstar, right? Like, this is not a team that they're like, okay, we're pretty much good to go. Let's just make some changes on the margins here, some marginal additions, and we should be good to go ahead and win a championship. I think in an honest moment, they would even tell you that they were surprised by last year's run to the finals after getting in as a play-in team. So this is a team that's been wanting to make a big move and has failed to make a big move for at least 2 years now. And yeah, I think when you sort of bring back the same basic team for 3 years in a row, the same core, things could get stale. And I think that's the fear. And I think that's kind of what I was feeling in the regular season too, and what this team was feeling in the regular season last year when they won just 44 games. And then all of a sudden everybody sparked in the postseason. Maybe all it takes to get excited about playing basketball together again is playoff basketball stakes. But there's no guarantee of making the playoffs, right? We know that. The Heat know that very well now, probably better than they did this time last year after barely making it as a play-in team. So they need to find that spark. How they find that spark, who knows? Again, maybe it's sort of the chip on their shoulder of the nobody believes in us thing again, but they need to find it.
You mentioned basically the same team you're bringing back, whether it's obviously Jimmy Butler, Bam Adebayo is going to be your core guys. Tyler Hero comes back after being in trade rumors, but you've got some other names that are still back. Caleb Martin, Kyle Lowry. There's some other guys off the bench, including Kevin Love, but two names in particular that are not there, Max Strus and Gabe Vincent, after losing them in free agency. Wondering just whether you think the new additions, whether it's Josh Richardson or maybe some internal improvements from somebody like Nikola Jovic could really help offset that, or is that a concern heading into the season for you guys?
It's got to be a concern, but I don't think it's as big of a concern as I think some people think it is. Yes, Gabe Vincent and Max Strus were the starting backcourt for the NBA Finals team, but they weren't the starting backcourt for most of the regular season. For most of the season, it was Kyle Lowry and Tyler Hero, and both of those guys are still there. They did add Josh Richardson, like you mentioned, who could play either the point or the two guard spot for them. This offense basically runs through Bam Adebayo and Jimmy Butler anyway, so you don't really need a traditional point guard if you want to kind of go in an alignment without one, which they can do. So yeah, I think this will be Tyler Hero stepping up and being better than he was the last couple of years, and I think that'll be the case. I think he was very good the last 2 years, 20 point per game score, and he continues to get better every single year, and I think you'll see that again. Can Kyle Lowry, they kind of figured out something last year with his minutes reduction. Let's play him like 20, 25 minutes off the bench. We can kind of manage his health that way. I think you'll see something similar to that this year. And then Josh Richardson knows the system. He knows the team. He's a plug-and-play guy. 36% career shooter, which is right around what Max Strus is, even though Max Strus is sort of considered like this elite shooter. Like percentage-wise, Josh Richardson's right there with Max Strus, so and better than Gabe Vincent. So I actually think from a three-point shooting perspective, they'll be better because also keep in mind, like last regular season, they were the worst three-point shooting team in the league out of all the teams that were actively trying to win games, right? Like they were the worst. And 2 years ago, when they were the number one seed, they were the best team in the league by three-point shooting percentage. They're probably not as good as they were 2 years ago, right? They're not the best three-point shooting team in the league. They're also not the worst three-point shooting team in the league. They'll probably settle somewhere right in the middle. And then that'll help really offset the losses of Max Strus and Gabe Vincent because they did provide some other things, but mostly what they did was space the floor around Jimmy and Bam, and that's really the goal when you're a role player on the Heat right now.
And Duncan Robinson's still coming off the bench.
Yes.
You've got Jaime Jaquez, who hasn't been mentioned at all, and there are some other interesting possible additions like a Thomas Bryant, who will be a good regular season player for them. Haywood Highsmith, Orlando Robinson, kind of in the background, but I'm curious whether you think those kinds of additions and maybe some of this internal improvement, like how does that affect the disparity between, hey, the regular season success, team won 44 games last year, 7th in the East, and then they go all the way to the NBA Finals, and this is a team that's been to either the conference finals or NBA Finals for 3 of the last 4 seasons. How does one parse that? How does one parse the difference between this kind of average regular season team versus an elite playoff team?
Yeah, you can even go further back to when they acquired Jimmy Butler that first year in the summer of 2019. This is typically a team that in the regular season wins between 40 and 45 games. In the regular season, they have one outlier year where they won 54 games, I believe it was, when they were the 1 seed 2 years ago. That was the outlier, right? Usually this team is just slightly above 500 in the regular season. Of course, they went to the finals 2 out of those 3 years that we were talking about when they won, between 40 and 45 games. So I do think that there's something to the idea that the Heat are more built for the playoffs than they are the regular season. What I will push back on and have pushed back on, basically since this became a talking point, was the Heat have figured it out. They don't even care about the regular season. It's all about the playoffs. Trust me, the Heat would much have rather been the number 1 seed last year than the number 8 seed and have to play the play-in tournament. Their goal this year is to not be in the play-in tournament. They value the regular season in a way that, hey, this is how we're going to learn our team, get better, make the changes that we need, and get ready to be that playoff juggernaut that we've basically been for the last 4 years. But the regular season is a big part of that process. But in doing that process, you got to win more basketball games than you won last year. And talking with people at training camp, they're like, yeah, we need to figure out how to be closer to what we were the second half of last year and in the playoffs than what we were in the first half of last year, where they were just sort of disorganized. They weren't making a lot of shots, and I thought that put them in a little bit of a funk. They got to figure out how to just win more games in the regular season so that they could be clearly in the top 6 in the Eastern Conference and avoid the play-in altogether.
I think that's completely fair, and I think the top 6 is a reasonable spot to think about where this team can go. I think the East overall, it looks like the East is probably in for a down year outside of a couple of teams at the top. I have this team winning 43 games and being the 6th seed in the East, and that seems kind of disparate with kind of having a Western Conference perspective, where I think maybe there's as many as 10 teams in the Western Conference that could really be above 500. 43 games could do it. Like it could be just fine. And I don't know if Miami is going to really have to stress themselves out too much in order to get out of that play-in tournament. But I have them at about 43 wins. Where do you think you see them?
Most of the over-unders have it at 46.5, and I think it's a really good number for Miami. I'm probably closer to you. I kind of keep settling in around like 45 wins. So, two game difference between you and I. But yeah, I think that's where this team will be. I think they've got a lot of things to figure out. You mentioned some of the guys that they lost. What's the best rotation going to be? They're still very much trying to figure things out. I think this is a team that can look a lot of different ways at a lot of different times this season. I also think that Jimmy Butler, I don't think that the 65 game minimum for NBA awards is going to matter. He played 64 games last year for Miami. He wouldn't have qualified. The other part of that is that those are the most amount of games in the regular season he's ever played in a Miami Heat uniform. I don't think he plays 64 games this year for the Heat. So you got to sort of build in, all right, what do we do for 30 games at least without Jimmy Butler, or 20 games without Jimmy Butler? I think that's a real thing that they got to figure out. So, I think 45 wins is typically, where I settle in on their win-loss over-under.
I think that's completely fair. But the real question with this team isn't necessarily about the regular season wins. As long as they get in, as long as you get them in the dance, then they have the potential to upset some teams, or maybe it's not even an upset if you've got playoff Jimmy on your side. So what is it going to take this time around for this team to go deep in the playoffs once again?
A couple things. Number one, you got to make your threes the way that they did last year. They as much as they struggled from 3-point range in the regular season, something clicked in the playoffs and they made everything. So that was a big help. Obviously, Jimmy Butler doing Jimmy Butler things. That's sort of this. If it's like a 3-pronged approach, those are the first 2 prongs. Make your threes, let Jimmy Butler turn into Michael Jordan for a couple months, and then go from there, right? The third part of this is you got to get the bracket to break right. Very obviously, Boston and Milwaukee, in whatever order, are the top 2 teams in the East, and it's not very close between those 2 teams and everybody else. You kind of, after that, got this like mushy kind of gray area that includes Philadelphia, Miami, Cleveland, the Knicks, Brooklyn, maybe Toronto, maybe all these teams that are sort of in there. Maybe you're really high on Indiana. You could throw them in there too. But I have no idea where those teams are going to finish. Cleveland, I don't know if you mentioned them. They're in there too. So whatever. But the other thing about Milwaukee and Boston is in making these big trades that, again, I think make them the favorites in the conference. That could hurt them in the regular season, right? Guys are going to miss games. I don't know that they have a ton of depth. They can lose a lot of games because of injuries to their star players because they just don't really have that depth. So I wouldn't just sort of in Sharpie say that Boston and Milwaukee are going to finish 1 and 2 in the East in the regular season when it's all said and done. Like they could one of them could finish first and one of them can finish with the 4th seed, and they end up on the same side of the bracket. The reason I bring all of this up, Ryan, is because Miami's best case scenario to make a deep playoff run is that one of those teams knocks the other one out before the Heat have to face them, right? And in that way, you only have to really face one of them, perhaps even as late as the Eastern Conference Finals, which would qualify as a deep playoff run. So those are sort of the 3-pronged approach. It's be healthy and have your identity ready for the playoffs. Everybody catches fire from 3-point range in the postseason. Jimmy Butler goes nuclear, Super Saiyan, whatever it is, and then you catch a break in the way that the bracket plays out.
I currently have this team as a first-round exit, and that to me feels pretty scary, given the fact that has not really borne out in 3 of the last 4 seasons. And you can go back and look through the history of teams and fans not counting, or they're counting out the Heat pretty consistently, and the Heat continue to prove them wrong. So obviously I'm a Nuggets guy mostly, and got to see the Heat up close and personal. They gave Denver the best challenge defensively, that's for sure. They made Denver work for it. So I hope to see the Heat back again in the finals. How cool would that be?
It would be very cool. It'd be great to go back to Denver for a few days. It would be very surprising again, just like it was last year too.
Who knows? You never know, Wes, but he is Wes Goldberg at WC Goldberg on Twitter or X, whatever you want to call it. Make sure to follow his work at Locked On Heat. All you can heat. He's the editor-in-chief over there. Wes, thank you so much for coming on, man.
Thanks, Ryan.
All right, joining me now is Stephen Cameron covering the Orlando Magic for Orlando Magic HQ. Stephen, thank you so much for hopping on with me, man. Really excited to catch all of your Magic coverage for this season.
Absolutely. This is going to be a really fun season. I'm stoked to be a part of this program with you this season.
Heck yeah, it's gonna be good, and this Orlando Magic season is gonna be really fascinating. After drafting Paolo Banchero, number 1 overall this last season, this is a year 2 jump, hopefully, for the Orlando Magic, where you start to center things around a true cornerstone piece. I am super excited to see where this team goes. This is I see this team as a Cinderella team for draft Twitter, basically, where everybody loves the pieces that they've added, loves the types of guys that they're going for. I mean, Wendell Carter and Franz Wagner are, I think, probably in the Hall of Fame of that class, but it should be very exciting to see where this team goes. Tell me, what do you think is the most exciting thing about this group right now?
I think you just see, you have 2 players that are both 2021, and Franz and Paolo coming off a really successful summer with playing, high level basketball for their countries. Paolo Banchero playing on the U.S. team on the second unit after already having a really awesome rookie campaign. Then you have Franz Wagner, had a little bit of injury. He didn't get to play the entire summer in FIBA, but when he was playing for the German team, definitely a part of the main reason they won the championship. And became world champions. And he became world champions. And he became, and that's after a really solid sophomore season where, Paolo averaged 20 points per season. Franz averaged 19, almost 20. And you're just seeing some continuity. But I think something that's like the most exciting outside of that is this is the first offseason in probably 4 or 5 years that the entire team is healthy, including a player like Jonathan Isaac, who hasn't had a healthy offseason since 2019. Markelle Fultz has entered training camp. Everyone is healthy, which is unheard of for this Magic roster. And so those are a couple of really exciting things that we have going on, right now. Continuity with Paolo and Franz, and then just having a really, really healthy roster going into training camp.
Well, Stephen, I'm going to blame you when it's jinxed. This is clearly so early time to be talking about health at this point. My gosh, man, that is a tough one. But I mean, hey, they are healthy right now, and I haven't seen this team healthy entering a training camp in a long, long time, as you mentioned. And it should be interesting to see what this group looks like when you give them a kind of a full runway, if you will, from training camp onward. Tell me more about Franz and Paolo. Tell me more about what these guys have brought to the table for this team that make them all-star, superstar types in the future?
Yeah, I mean, you have two 6'10" forwards that can handle the ball, score, and defend. Paulo's a growing defender. Obviously, Franz is a much more polished defender at this stage. I'd say Paulo's an above-average defender. I wouldn't quite put him in that elite tier yet, but he's definitely above average. He's a plus defender. Paulo's growing. He got a lot of really good defensive thought processing from playing the 5 with FIBA. And last year, he had his moments, but maybe not doing like a secondary rotation on a defensive assignment or, missing a switch here and there. But for the most part, you saw like, okay, there's some effort there. He's got some ways to go, but he'll get there. But like on the offensive side, you got Paulo who can be a three-level scorer. He's got to get his three-point shooting a little bit better. He was dealing with a nerve injury for about 2 months last year when he was missing every shot from 3. But I imagine that shot's going to continue to get better. And, he's a beast in the paint. He's got a good mid-range game. And he's already become a fairly smart passer out of double and triple teams, which he got a ton of last year. And so they're just both high IQ players that are excited to play next to each other. You have Paulo Banchero, who just won Rookie of the Year and was playing for Team USA, tell Franz, dude, you are the man. Like, I want you to be everything that you possibly can, and pushing him to be like the number one player on this team. Like they're pushing each other to be this collaborative, duo, which is really cool. And then you have the coach Jamal Mosley, who is also pushing them to be more vocal leaders within the locker room and really starting to hand them more of not just the on-court role and responsibilities, but the off-court, in the locker room, talking on the court defensively and offensively, and just kind of being more vocal leaders on the team. So it's just like, Paulo might make his first all-star team this year if things go right for him and he continues that progress. It's pretty clear for him, and Franz is like, draft darling, but also analytical darling. He just does so many things well. He's kind of just like a Swiss Army knife that it's just hard not to see him being a complimentary player to this roster and one of the top 2 or maybe top 3 players on this team, as they continue to grow and try and make winning a bigger priority for this franchise.
You never want to put a ceiling on a duo, and I think that this is a very unique duo where it's very rare to have 2 forwards that are the same size like this. Sometimes you could get wings like a Jaylen Brown, Jason Tatum. Most of the time you're getting a guard and a big, or a guard and a forward like a Jokic and a Murray or somebody like that. But I do think that this is just a very unique way to build the roster, kind of locking those guys into the 3 and the 4. Not really seeing those guys as players that can play the 5, although Paulo did play the 5 for Team USA, so maybe that's something that's in his future. But it's kind of nice to have the 3 and the 4 spots entrenched for a team for the foreseeable future. Now, what about the guards? Because one of the things that I have here is, will a cornerstone guard please stand up? Because I'm still waiting to see which one it's going to be, because there are so many candidates, and a lot of candidates have come through. I'm just not sure which one they're ultimately going to settle on.
I can tell you this, Ryan. I'm not sure any of the guards on our team are going to be all-star players. I don't know. I'm not going to put that ceiling on them, but none of them are like, yeah, you can just point to them. That's definitely a future all-star in the next couple of years, right? Markelle Fultz, everyone knows the story about him. Had the nerve issue with his arm, all the ups and downs with Philly, comes to the Orlando, has ACL injury, then comes into training camp last year with a broken toe, misses 20 games into the season, 20 or 30. I forget exactly when he came back. I think around game 20. And he's crafty, a good floor general. He can get our guys into good positions, and he's a pretty smart passer. Every now and then he tries to do a little bit too much and can be a little turnover prone. Really good finisher at the rim. He's got some good size. And last year, one thing, his biggest areas of growth that I saw was his defense. He's definitely become a plus defender for this team too. But it's always going to come back to his shot, because it's really hard for a team that's going to be built around its two forwards to have a point guard that they can't pass to and hope that to make an outside basket when left open, right? And that goes to that. That's the kind of the same story with Anthony Black, right? His question mark as a player is going to be, will his 3-pointer ever get to a respectable level from, in this league, in the NBA? So you have Markelle Fultz. He's the bona fide starter this year. Until the team finds the next guy or someone grows within this team to be that guy, Markelle Fultz, it's his job to lose. And there's no one on this roster currently that's going to take it from him. Cole Anthony, he's kind of the supercharged 6-man right now. He's on some, maybe there's a handful of teams he could be a starter on in the league, but for the most part, he's kind of filling into that 6-man role nicely. Right. And then you have Jalen Suggs, who's an elite defender. I mean, seriously, there's not too many guard defenders out there better than him. People just haven't noticed it yet.
Sure.
But it's the offense. Can that continue to slow down a little bit for him? Can he continue his shooting that he finished with the last 30 games of the year last year, where he was shooting, I think, 38% from 3 on about 4 or 5 attempts per game? He had a really nice ending to his sophomore season last year, shot-wise. And we want to see that come back into this season and be a consistency with him. If that happens, then boom, we got it. But right now, I think for where this team is at, long term, there's still some questions. But I think for right now, you have Markelle Fultz starting. You have Gary Harris, veteran, 28 years old, 41% from 3 on 4 attempts per game last year. On this roster, he's going to be the starting 2 guard, good defender too. He's finally, healthy, ended last year healthy offseason going into this. I mean, Gary Harris really well.
Sure.
He's kind of looking back to those solid years when he was with Denver, before all the injuries started hitting him hard. It's his role to lose. The only person he's gonna lose that to is Gary Harris Jalen Suggs if his shot is a threat enough. Because Jalen Suggs' defense and transition is definitely a lot better than Gary Harris at this point. But then on the bench you have, so you got those 2 starters, Fultz and Harris. Then on the bench you have 6-man Cole Anthony, and then defensive specialist next to him, Jalen Suggs. So, and then we just drafted a wing in Jett Howard, who could play some 2, 3, maybe some 4. And then you have Anthony Black, point large guard. It's where do they fit? Well, this is finally the year where it's been spoken about. Minutes are going to have to be earned. They're not just going to be gifted. These guys are likely not going to be consistent rotation players unless they outplay someone or there's injuries, which there will be eventually.
Sure.
And they get in. There's some committee things where it's cool, maybe we need more defense. So they pair Suggs and Anthony Black next to each other for a specific matchup.
Sure.
Here and there if Black is growing in that way. But yeah, as someone who is high on this team and high on a lot of those guards, I still have the same question for you. Which one is going to be that really primary third player to complement Franz and Paulo? I think Fultz is a really good stopgap unless he can grow into that. I'm slightly lower on Fultz than a lot of other Magic fans, but I'm still really high on him, if that makes any sense. But I think he's fine for now. Let's just put it that way.
Yeah, it's completely fair. And it's going to be difficult when you're tied up to a guy. You'd like to see that guy be successful, the vision of whatever it is. I think people would love to see that go through and then be pretty seamless. But I'm surprised that you had Suggs not starting for whatever reason. I think that's going to be one that I would watch throughout the year. If you really believe in Suggs, if you're the Magic, then he's a third-year guy. You're going to want to see him play with those other 2 cornerstones as often as possible, in my mind, to see if he can develop into that. So that's a fascinating one.
I do think he's going to get plenty of time with them. Just because he's coming off the bench, it doesn't mean he's not going to get enough playing time. Last year, Gary Harris was playing about 24 minutes a game. Jalen Suggs was about that too. So they're neither one, like Gary Harris isn't playing 30 plus minutes to really minimize Jalen Suggs' role. He's going to get plenty of playing time. And then when, maybe not in the beginning of the season, but as things continue and coach starts to shorten his rotation, he's often staggering Paulo or Franz, one or two starters with the second unit.
Right.
Mostly oftentimes it's one. It's normally Paulo or Franz with the second unit. So he will get plenty of time with the starters in certain segments. And, eventually, honestly, I think this could be one of those situations where, maybe come December time, his shot has proven enough and he's making an impact elsewhere to where maybe he earns the starting role over Gary Harris. But I also just think like that starting unit next to Fultz, you need someone who's going to hit the three and be able to not just hit the three but pull defenses to them. Gary Harris does that right now, where Jalen Suggs does not. So for spacing reasons, you kind of need to have Gary Harris out there for the moment until Suggs is starting to pull more defenses to the 3-point line for him.
I think that's completely fair. To me, what this reminds me of is kind of it's not a morass, but it is a lot of talented players, a lot of different options that you can pick and choose from. Jonathan Isaac, not somebody that you even thought about. Joe Ingles, somebody who you bring in and is going to be a veteran contributor off the bench, I assume. Moritz Wagner's still going to be there. Caleb Houston played last year. Jet Howard's going to play, or maybe he won't, and they're going to have to find out and pick and choose which of those guys you're going to go for. Last year, this team finished on a big run, and I think they were 29-28 in their last 57, if I'm not mistaken. I'm not entirely sure that run was sustainable, given that I understand that it could just automatically translate into a 41-41 record, but there are still questions in my mind, and when you mix and match and you're not quite sure who's going to build around, what you're going to build around, which of those guys you're going to actually commit to, that to me gives me some pause. I'm going to predict this team to win 35 games next year, but I suspect that you are way higher than I am on them.
I'm a little higher. I'm not going to say way higher, Ryan. I like to put this team closer to 38-42, right? So a couple games higher in that around 500 record, maybe a little bit before. And that's not because I'm not high on this team, but it's very competitive league. You and I were talking about that right before we hit record on this. And I have a lot of respect for a lot of other teams, but there are some teams that are in question on what they're going to do. Depending on how the season starts, there's question marks around the Raptors. There's question marks around Chicago. Those are guys that are going to be in that kind of same tier with the Magic in the East as far as competitive window. I'll add the Pacers in there too.
Yeah, I was just going to say the Pacers. I think you could make an argument that this team finishes better than all three of those teams.
Potentially, yeah.
For the purpose of this, I just have them finishing below by one game below the Raptors. But it's tough. It's a competitive league.
Yeah, it is a competitive league. I think that 35 wouldn't surprise me if that's what they finished with. It would be a little disappointing, but not unsurprising just because of the competitiveness of this league and just the way this team is. But I also wouldn't be surprised if they crack 42 wins at the same time. So, or even maybe a hair more and they're the 6th seed for some reason in the playoffs. Their floor is kind of high. I think at 35. I'd be surprised if they lost, if they didn't win at least that many. But I think their ceiling is also pretty high. I think they could be a potential 6th seed. And if everything goes right? If Jonathan Isaac is healthy this entire offseason or this entire season and he plays 50 to 60 games at 20 minutes a night, that's unheard of. If he's healthy, we even saw it last year. He is a high level, high IQ defensive player that can do the right things with the ball in his hands. When I say the right things, make the right pass, make the right, starting to grow as a shooter and hit open shots.
Sure.
So that is something that is really nice to have, and could help push us over the top. There's always the rumors about Markelle Fultz shot coming around this offseason. Supposedly it has. I'm not really one that believes that. That's why I always say I'm a little bit slower on him. But for some reason, if that's a thing, that could help this. If Paulo and Franz make that next step in their career, in their growth and their development, that's going to help this team. Wendell Carter Jr. plays 70 games instead of like 60 and is healthy. I think there's just a lot of upside for us to be a sneaky good team this year. Kind of like the Cavs of like 2 seasons ago.
Sure.
But there's also that other point of this team's really young, still relying on a lot of young players. Our oldest veterans are Joe Ingles at 36 and Gary Harris at 28. And then it's a bunch of 25-year-olds and lower. So there is areas where, where you can see mistakes happening, but the players, the coaching staff, they all know and are talking about they need to take that next step as competitively. It's also why I say players have to earn their roles. They're no longer being gifted them because this front office is kind of done experimenting right now. They want to see some wins.
Sure.
Not saying it's a playoff or bust season, but we got to win. And we got to show that we're going in the right direction and not going to end up with the 6th pick in the lottery again. Oh,
of course. And to be clear, I do think that this team is going to show something. I think that at least whether it's Paolo or Franz taking that next step, or if it's one of these guards that we're talking about, one of them becomes that clear third guy. I think that will happen. I think that this will be the year for that. Maybe it doesn't translate into wins on the court the entire time, but I do think that there's a reason for optimism in Orlando for sure, and that the trajectory of this team is clearly on the up and up. So that is an exciting aspect of this here. Quick, give me one bold prediction on your way out.
The Magic make the 6th seed.
Wow. Hell yeah. Let's go. I'm excited for that.
Little luck, right? We need some teams ahead of us to have some troubles, and we need to have a little bit of better performance. But like I said, I think this team has a really high ceiling. Also with a lower floor at like 35. And we're still in that media day, early training camp hype where everyone is excited. I'm still excited. So before I come down to earth a little bit, let's go. 6th seed Orlando Magic.
I can't wait, man. It's going to be good. He is Stephen Cameron of Orlando Magic HQ. Congrats on the move, and I'm excited to check out all your Orlando Magic coverage this year, man.
Thanks, Ryan. It's going to be a lot of fun chatting with you this season. Let's keep going.
All right, joining me now is Neil Dalal, who is covering the Washington Wizards for Hoop District and also does some special work for Sports Rabbi, covering Denny Avdia specifically. Neil, thank you so much for taking the time with me, man. Really excited to see your Wizards coverage this year.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me, Ryan.
Of course, and let's get right into it. Obviously, Washington made some big moves this offseason, trading Bradley Beal, trading Kristaps Porzingis. It feels like going a little bit of a different direction this year. What can you tell us about what's interesting about the team right now? What are you most looking forward to covering about this team this year?
Yeah, absolutely. Like you said, there's been a lot of turnover for the organization, in the past 5-6 months. The owner, Ted Leonsis, made the decision to move on from then front office president Tommy Shepard, kind of citing that, back-to-back years and not making the playoffs, which are always important to him. He didn't see, much of a vision. And, I think it was really, a strong offseason for Washington to get a guy like Michael Winger and have him then grab a guy like Will Dawkins from Oklahoma City, Travis Schlenk, who was, the president of basketball operations in Atlanta, who, drafted and created that Trae Young era team with the Hawks. And so, they quickly made the decision that, hey, we are not going to be a sustainable winner around a team built around, Bradley Beal, Kristaps Porzingis, and Kyle Kuzma. They quickly came to that realization. I think the fan base, came to that realization maybe a couple years ago. But Beal was always someone coveted by the owner, Ted Leonsis, and wanted to keep him around. But now it's, a blank canvas, as Jordan Poole and Kyle Kuzma are always saying and repeating. Obviously, Poole was the byproduct of, then flipping Chris Paul, who was, the main get in the Bradley Beal to Phoenix trade. I think Winger, Dawkins, and company did a great job then flipping Chris Paul, to Golden State for Jordan Poole, who, people might think he had a down year. I think anybody who had, the weeks before the season started that he did last year would have had a down year after that awkwardness. But he's coming in and he's hungry and he's going to be able to, get the reins and, really flap his wings a bit. I think for me, that's definitely going to be the number one thing that's, going to be exciting. But there are storylines really all over the place, even though, it's a team that's not really going to be contending for much this season. It's all going to be about development.
Yeah, development is the direction that they've finally chosen and has felt for a while like the Wizards in the previous regime were more of a let's see what happens kind of team, definitely waiting and sitting on their hands a little bit. Now you've picked a direction if you're the Wizards and you are going with this direction with Jordan Poole kind of as your first option scorer, maybe your second option if you're high on Kyle Kuzma. What do you think that's going to look like for the offense this year for Washington? And is that something that it's more of a fun factor kind of decision or more, hey, let's see what Jordan actually can provide on that end?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, really let him see how great he can be. He's 24 years old. Will Dawkins, the GM, describes him as a pre-prime player, still growing into his own. He's going to have the ball in his hands way more than, he did obviously playing in Golden State where you have, arguably, multiple Hall of Famers over there that he's trying to share the ball with. I think what's going to be interesting that Kyle Kuzma noted was, both Kuzma and Poole, have played with Hall of Fame players and had to be, third or fourth options on a team. So they learned how to play off ball. And so maybe now that complements each other, even though the ball is going to be in their hands a lot of times, when it's not, they can still be effective and still contribute to what the Wizards are trying to do. I think offensively, Jordan Poole is, saying that, hey, I'm not going to be, shot hunting every night, trying to get his or anything like that. I know Stephen A. Smith, put out about James Harden that, he wanted to go to Houston and get a scoring title. And Jordan Poole is not anything like that. He's saying that, hey, I've always prided myself on being, not a me player. He wants to still do what's in the best interest of the team, even if he doesn't get an assist because he got the hockey assist, on a particular play. He's always trying to make that pass. If he draws two, he's fine with giving up, the ball to somebody who has to be open elsewhere on the court. So, obviously it's early. It's media day, and media day is an optimistic time for, a lot of teams around the NBA, but they're all saying the right things. They all have the right attitude. They all seemingly have the right character and, just desire to compete day in and day out. And, we'll see. Jordan Poole and Kyle Kuzma are obviously going to now be getting, number one and number two defenders going at them every night, seeing double teams that they might not be, as accustomed to be seeing. And that's where, you might see some struggles. But, Jordan Poole, I would got to say, I haven't watched too much of him being in the Western Conference for the first part of his career, but exciting player, can light it up, has a lot of talent, and, really is going to be able to make of it what he can this season.
Should be a fascinating rotation as well. Right now I'm looking at a starting lineup that's kind of projected as Tyus Jones, Jordan Poole, Denny Avdia, Kyle Kuzma, and Daniel Gafford. Does that sound about right to you, or am I missing somebody in that lineup?
No, I think certainly, if I were to guess right now, Wes Unseld Jr. is always someone to, keep it kind of close to the vest until he has to show his cards, come October 25th when they travel and open up the season in Indiana. But I would say, that's about right. We'll see if Daniel Gafford is fully healthy. He had a hard spill in a pickup game, I believe, a week ago today. We're recording this on Friday. It was last Friday of September. And so they're being very cautious and just saying, hey, 2 to 4 weeks and, we're going to reevaluate. So, there's a slight possibility that, you could see Danilo Gallinari, making his return from, a pretty grueling ACL rehab, as a starting five for the Wizards if Gafford is not quite healthy or, not quite up to conditioning standards. The 3 spot is probably the other, a little bit of a question mark. I think, it makes sense to have Denny Avdia as your starter there. to kind of complement, maybe a little bit of the defensive deficiencies you might have, with a smaller front or smaller backcourt that is of Tyus Jones and Jordan Poole. Denny Avdia is a very strong defender, does not necessarily need the ball in his hands a ton as a starter. So I think that makes the most sense over a guy like, say, Corey Kispert, who also is, not necessarily the greatest defender in the world. But I think, the 5, if Daniel Gafford is healthy, that's pretty much what they're going to try and see and get out of him. And then the 3 is, I would agree, Denny Avdia is probably the front runner there, but, you might see, Corey Kispert potentially try and, snag that role as well.
Tell me a little bit about Johnny Davis, Bilal Coulibaly, both of those guys, young players. Now, if you're a team like Washington that is looking to develop a little bit and looking for long-term building blocks per se, it seems like it would be in the right course of action to let those guys play and see where they're at. But in previous regimes, and even under Wes Unseld, Johnny Davis took a lot of time to kind of get into that lineup last year. What can you tell us about the direction with those 2 young guys specifically?
Yeah, so obviously, Johnny Davis was the 10th overall pick last year, comes in and was not drafted by this front office, quite frankly. And, to some players that might be, a little bit demoralizing. But I think the one nice thing that Michael Winger and Will Dawkins have come in and done and made clear is, hey, everything that happened in the past, whatever. It's a clean slate. We're ripping off the rearview mirror. We're going to worry about what's going forward now. And I think that's very fair because, as Winger said, they had different intentions and different goals last year. They were trying to make the playoffs last year. They were trying to get, a little bit of, first-round playoff revenue by having, 2 home games at Capital One Arena. I think Johnny Davis particularly, the things that people might not understand is that, it took him some time to go from the year 1 to year 2 player he was just at Wisconsin. At year 2, after of which then he obviously, became a lottery pick in the NBA, he took a massive jump. Year 1, I don't think anybody had him on a radar as not alone a lottery pick, but even a first rounder. People wouldn't have even thought he would have declared for the draft after just his sophomore year. I think he can make that same jump again this year. Obviously, it's a very crowded guard lineup and rotation in Washington right now. And we might see things, open up more for him, post-trade deadline if a couple guys are moved. But also people don't realize that Johnny Davis is a young guy. He had his first kid this time last year during training camp. I cannot imagine being a 20-year-old or however old he was, having a screaming, crying baby at home trying to get ready to play an NBA season. So there's a very much a human element to this. And he took his time. I think by the end of the year, you saw him get a little bit more confidence. He now, spent a lot of time in DC this past offseason. So the playing time might be, up and down, and he might have to play again, some minutes with the Capital City Go-Go. But I think you're going to see a much more confident Johnny Davis. And maybe, he strikes enough of a, glow for the new front office where they're like, okay, we're going to pick up his third-year option. We're going to keep him in, the rotation and whatnot. So hopefully, Johnny, a very nice guy, kind of keeps to himself, but, he should be able to be, a good rotation player for Washington for years to come. As for Bilal, he's been, a pleasure to, discuss with and talk with, in just a few times that we've interacted post-draft. Obviously, the Wizards kind of, took some people by surprise by not moving up to 7th instead of, their spot at 8th. They were kind of, getting worried that, Oklahoma City might have tried to jump from 10 to 7 to get in front of them. Obviously, Will Dawkins is from year, with his old colleagues there. But this is a guy, 19 years old, 3rd youngest player in the NBA. The Wizards are raving about him, and I can see why. He has such a great demeanor for a 19-year-old. I wish I was that mature when I was 19, but, he's all about the right things. He's hungry. He has a great attitude. They know that, okay, his prime is not going to be for 5, 6, 7 years down the road, but, he already can come in and be a potential, strong defender in today's NBA. All of the offensive stuff, might, take some time, but, even small things like Jordan Poole going in the locker room and moving his locker next to his own. Those are things that, people might not realize, but that's a huge thing for a young kid's confidence And just being able to have someone like Jordan Poole in his ear, giving him the ins and outs. Denny Avdia said the same thing. He said, hey, I was in this spot, same as him 3 years ago, being a young kid coming to a new country, trying to make a name for himself in the NBA. So we might, it'll be to be determined. Again, it's a very packed guard and wing room rotation-wise for the Wizards, who are trying to be competitive because that's the good habits they want to build. So we'll see how much playing time Bilal gets the first half of the season. Again, like Johnny, some of it might be coming, with the Capital City Go-Go, but, it will be very much a, development, get him used to NBA lifestyle kind of start for Bilal, who, again, is very charming, very charismatic guy, always has a smile on his face. So
sure,
you can see why the Wizards, made that pick at 7 and said, we don't care what any mock draft thinks, we're going to go get our guy.
Love that. Also very interesting to think of Jordan Poole, the steady veteran in the ear of Bilal Coulibaly. That's very interesting. Okay. Well, so there's clearly talent here. There's clearly talent and rotation caliber talent for this team. I'm not sure what the direction looks like still. I think that it's going to be definitely a work in progress throughout the season, trying to see what happens. I don't have this team winning a lot of games. I think I have them at about 24 wins, but where do you see them this year? And what do you think is the goal for this season right at this point?
Yeah, I think, Vegas also set, the over-under line for them at 24.5 this year. I believe somebody told me that is literally the lowest line of all 30 NBA teams that Vegas has set this year. I think they're going to definitely clear that, because this is not a tank rebuild. They're not going to be purposely losing, trying to get a better, lottery pick or whatever it might be. They're trying to, form good habits. They as much of the, rotation players that we've talked about a little bit, they have several veterans on this team who, are going to play competitive basketball and not going to have to necessarily go through, growing pains of, adjusting and making mistakes and things like that. So, Michael Winger said it. There are going to be games this year where you don't expect them to be in it or, potentially win, but I think that's where they're going to catch teams by surprise. Opposing teams might come in and think, oh, it's the Wizards, they're not contending for anything this year. It's going to be an easy night. That was a bunch of games that the, John Wall era Wizards would lose to sub 500 teams. I think now the roles are kind of reversed, where the Wizards are going to kind of be playing the role of spoilers at times for other teams. 24, wins, to me, that's a bit too low. It's less than a third of the games. It's only 30% of games. I can see them winning, 30 games because they're going to try and, be, that workmanship mentality day in and day out, always trying to get better, always trying to improve. Obviously, knock on wood, as with any team, you got to hope that injuries, stay away. But I don't see why this team couldn't win, 30 games. Obviously, they're not really trying to compete for the play-in and maybe squeak into the playoffs or anything like that. They're trying to let things happen naturally.
Right.
But I still think that, you're going to catch teams on bad nights, either, second night of back-to-back or, they just are overlooking you a little bit. And that's going to be, 6 to maybe 12, games right there that you might not pencil in as wins at the beginning of the season, but, could flip in the Wizards' direction.
Well, we will see what happens, Neil. He is covering the Washington Wizards for Hoop District. Neil, thank you so much for tuning in, and thank you for your work this season, and good luck.
Appreciate it. Thanks, Ryan.
All right, that'll do it for this episode of the Alley-Oop Podcast. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you to our Southeast Division correspondents, Brad Rowland, Walker Mehl, Wes Goldberg, Stephen Cameron, and Neil Dalal. You guys are great, and I really do appreciate the time. Up tomorrow will be the Northwest Division, my home crowd. We've got a bunch of guys there, including Brendan Vogt covering the Nuggets. Really excited about this crew. Thank you so much, everybody, for taking the time. Make sure to leave a rating, review, and subscribe to the podcast on either the audio or the video, or both. Both would be great. Both would be awesome. Thank you so much, everybody. Have a great weekend.